Hi guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to the shop. Today I'm going to show you how I made this crystal star quilt pattern cutting board. Now this project was kind of fun because I decided to play around with color and I created 3 different frames of maple, walnut, and padauk. If you like this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, leave me a comment, and if you have time, subscribe to the channel. So if you're ready, let's head to the shop. I started this project at the miter saw, milling up lumber. I cut each piece to 24 inches. I cut up maple, sapele, padauk, and walnut. Normally this DeWalt miter saw doesn't have any issues getting through this 8-quarter lumber, but it might be time for a new blade. Whenever I'm using my miter saw and I'm using a specific species, I'll gather up some dust just in case I need them for repairs later. If you enjoy making your entire workspace red, this is the species for you. Next, I headed over to the jointer and did one face and one edge. That way each piece is at 90 degrees. Then headed over to the planer and made the second face parallel. The DeWalt 735 is a wonderful planer for small shops. And clearly doesn't seem to bother the shop dog. Thanks for hanging out, Rufus, and for bringing the propeller tail. I'll then go to my table saw and set the blade to 45 degrees. For this project, I'm going to need a lot of angled pieces. I started with the sapele, then maple, which really seemed to bog down my table saw, and again it might just be time for a new blade. Normally I don't have any problems with this job site table saw from DeWalt. It's great for a small shop and you really can do fine woodworking with it. Once I finished up with the padauk and walnut, it's time to make those angled sections. I glued up a piece of maple to a piece of walnut, getting plenty of pressure, but also I used these simple clamps made out of plywood to keep the sections lined up. When you're doing any kind of an angle, there is a propensity for those boards to want to slip, so providing pressure in multiple directions is important. And for those of you who've watched my previous videos, isn't it nice that I finally have a workbench? I'll then glue up the other species, gluing the sapele to the maple as well. I tend to be pretty generous with glue. It's inexpensive, and for this type of work, it doesn't really actually impede adhesion if you use too much. When you're doing other types of fine woodworking, you don't want to overdo glue. It can actually get in the way of your joint. While I'm showing you each species getting glued up, I actually did multiple sections because I did have 3 boards to make and I was going to need a lot of these angled sections. When I'm doing these glue ups, I like to leave the glue to set up for about 10 to 15 minutes. Rather than wiping it off with a wet cloth, I'll just wait for it to get a little tacky and then I'll scrape it off using an old chisel. That maple did get a little bit burnt. Just another example of why I need to probably either sharpen, replace, or maybe just clean up my table saw blade. After 24 hours, I removed the clamps and had a little trouble here. I've had some comments that if I used packing tape, that would go better. And I had another person who commented that using paste wax would be more helpful just to keep the tape from adhering to each of the boards. After this board, I used the paste wax and it went amazing. So I really appreciate all the comments that you guys leave for my videos. As much as I want to teach you, I love that you guys also help me learn. Once the boards are out of glue up, I'll use a scraper to remove any of the large chunks of glue that were left behind, just making it flat and ready to go back through the planer. For this board, I wanted to try something a little bit different. I've done angled pieces in the past, and when I've taken them back to the table saw, I've cut them right at the line where the two species intersect. But this time I wanted to try cutting them a little bit large and then using the planer to get them down to a perfect size. So in this step, you'll see me cutting each piece at the table saw, and I'm cutting them a little bit large so that there's slight overhang from the padauk, the walnut, and the sapele to the maple. Then I'll go over and fine-tune things by getting them perfectly square at the planer. I've had a lot of people ask me how large these squares are. Generally, when I mill up the lumber, I just try to keep things as large as possible so that the squares end up as large as possible. Generally, that means they're around like 1 3/4, almost to that 2-inch mark. But anytime you buy 8/4 lumber and mill it up, you're not going to end up with a 2-inch piece. You're going to end up with something slightly smaller. And for me, it's just about keeping the pieces as large as possible. You can absolutely make them smaller, or if you happen to get some 10/4 lumber that you're milling up and can actually get them down to 2 inches, you could make all these pieces 2 inches. But the general rule is just try to make them a square. And that way each piece is sort of interchangeable. You can turn it in different directions, and you can, move pieces around within the work, and every single time it'll fit. So at the planer, I'll mill each piece down to a perfect square so that each of the triangles comes to a perfect point. The next step is to get the larger maple pieces. I can do that by setting 2 of the angled pieces into the table saw and lining it up. So here I am just showing you all the pieces and their configurations, and then it's on to what I consider the second glue up. So we're going to glue up each of the edge grain boards using the angled pieces. I'll spread the glue and then rotate the pieces to start to make the patterns. It's a lot of glue ups and a lot of separate boards go into this, so I generally try to make multiple boards at once versus making just one, but because this is sort of an experiment, these boards maybe aren't the most efficient use of lumber or the most efficient use of time, and that's just because we're in the experimental phase. Once I've made a board once, I will go through a process of determining how to make the most efficient use of my time, how to make the most efficient use of lumber, so that I can batch these out in larger numbers in order to maximize profits when selling cutting boards. So this is the third board. This one I made out of the sapele and the walnut. And again, it's kind of just the same process repeated over and over again. I'll line the boards up on the clamps. Again, try to maximize the board so I don't have as much to cut off on the end. And then I'll use clamps over the top in order to prevent any bowing of the project. These boards will still go back through the planer to make sure they're nice and flat. But if I can prevent myself from having to destroy that perfect angle on those 45-degree pieces, I will. Maintaining those triangles is probably the most important part of doing this project. I see a lot of people end up cutting off the edge of the triangle, and I really try to make it a crisp connection from one 45 to the other. So here's all 4 of the boards glued up and ready to go. I'll take them back through the planer so that they're all exactly the same thickness and they have a nice clean edge. The goal here again, keep that 45 degree. Then it's back to the table saw where I'll set up a stop block, cutting each of these to just under 2 inches, trying to maintain that perfect square for each of those sections. So if the original pieces were around 1 3/4 inches, I'll set the table saw stop block to 1 3/4 inches. Then this becomes kind of the repetitive process of using the table saw and this crosscut sled that I made to cut each board into all of its strips. It's not a difficult process, but it can take a little bit of time. And each of the 4 boards gets cut into sections. I'll generally cut up as much as I can out of each of these boards, even though it may be more than I need for the project, because you never know when you're going to find a knot or a crack in the middle of a board. This is my favorite part, revealing the pattern. And I played around with this a lot to see what I could do with this. Could I intersperse the colors? Was it better to have the large pieces of maple all together? So kind of a fun process. Again, a little bit of experimentation here. Once I put these all together, I thought because this is one of my quilted boards that I really wanted it to have a border. So it was back to my miter saw to cut up more lumber to create the borders. I decided that the best look was a border out of maple, a border out of walnut, and a border out of padauk. Once I finish up over at the miter saw, I head over to the jointer and then the planer. Then I'll cut up these boards. It's sort of an arbitrary, I just cut each board into 3 parts in order to glue up a larger end grain piece that would be long enough to make the edges of these boards. These boards ended up being quite long, about 18 inches, which is not huge, but it is longer than I usually make boards, mainly because my planer can only handle about 12 inches, and it kind of gets strange if you make a 12-inch by 18-inch or 12-inch by 20-inch board. The board starts to look a little weird and feel a little weird. I glued up each of these boards to create that end grain border. And again, I'm pretty generous with glue here. And I know I probably should be using my new workbench, but it was actually occupied by another project, so I did all of this on the floor. Then I cleaned up the edge of each of these boards using a tapering jig on the table saw because it would support the work the most. Since this is end grain, I couldn't really take it back through the jointer to clean up the edge. And I cut each of the boards into that 1 3/4 inch so that they were the same thickness as the pieces that I cut from each of the cutting boards. It does make it easier if they're the same height as the board. The width of these borders can be variable. You'll see the maple is much thicker, so those borders are going to be quite wide, whereas the walnut is really like only 1 inch, so the borders of the walnut boards are going to be a little bit thinner. That's fine. It's more of an aesthetic appeal, and I ended up liking the way the walnut turned out. The next step is to glue up each of the final boards. I added the border piece at the top and the bottom of the board, and then it's just about revealing that fun pattern. So here's where you really have to be a little meticulous as you're putting this together, because as you glue this, you're going to get a lot of slipping and sliding. You could add sawdust or salt to the glue joint, and sometimes that will help keep it from sliding around. But I just tend to take my time, and while there is a time factor of around 10 minutes that you want to get these glued up and ready to go, I do take my time as I'm lining up each of the sections, because if you kind of get a little bit off here, it makes it look really strange if just one of those corners doesn't line up perfectly. So I'll take my time and line it up, add the clamps. As I'm tightening it, I'm paying close attention to each of those corners that things are lined up perfectly. So for this board, I decided to put the 2 large pieces of maple together to create like a big open area. And I did the same thing for this board with the padauk border. That's hard to say. The glue up process is maybe not the most fun process to watch, but it is the most critical process as we're going through each of these boards. And again, I kind of just tried to mix up the colors a little bit here. So I originally thought, oh, I'll make a board that's like padauk and sapele, or just the padauk and the walnut, but it actually looked better when I added all 3 of the colors together and just mixed and matched. So that's the fun part about making something that's, consistent squares, is you can mix and match and kind of create something fun. The next step is to go back to the table saw, and using that crosscut sled, I cut off the little overhangs of the borders. Then I added the side borders. So for the maple board, I decided to offset the way that the large pieces of maple came together. I thought this would be kind of fun because it broke up that large section and kind of created a little bit of a visually different pattern. So I'm not sure which one I liked better. So let me know in the comments which one you like better. So I glued up each of the borders, adding those side sections. And then there was my very first shop accident. So I had been cleaning up some glue from clamps, and if you ever wanted to know what 1 gallon of acetone dropped on a cutting board is, this is the effect. It sort of melted all the glue joints and made the padauk run all over the place. And I was very sad because I liked this padauk board, but I kind of set it to the side and continued on with the project because at least the maple and the walnut boards were slightly affected, but not nearly as much. So the next step is to flatten the boards. So I use a 3/4 inch rabbit bit and use my router and this sled that I made for my router. I secured the boards using a hot glue gun, and then once the boards are flattened, I'll flip them over and do the other side. I like to start the process by going around the entire board. I find that I get less tear out. When you're doing an end grain board like this, it doesn't really matter which direction you go in because no matter what, you're working on end grain. So if you were using edge grain and going around the board, you might get more tear out if you didn't go in just one direction, but I find going back and forth is still an effective process. So I did the maple board and the walnut board. Padauk board kind of bled all over them, so it looks like a little bit of a padauk murder scene. But once I flattened the boards with the router, that sort of mess was all cleaned up, and you really couldn't tell on these other two boards. So the walnut board gets the same treatment. I kind of go around the edges and then flatten the entire surface of the board. Then I'll go back to the table saw and flush up each of the edges. This is a great opportunity to decide exactly how thick you want those borders to be. I really like the way that the walnut border was kind of a thinner border, so I ended up doing that with the maple as well. And then it's on to sanding. I'll sand each board with 80, 120, 180, 220, and then 320. I used to pop the grain and add water after every single grit, but I had a lot of suggestions that I didn't have to do that after every grit, that it was just an important process as I got further along. So this time I just popped the grain after the 220 before I did 320, and it worked great. It still ended up with a board that was super smooth, and if it got water on it later, it didn't end up creating that roughness. But it is an important process to pop the grain, and I love it that adding water kind of gives you that first glimpse of what the end colors are going to be. It just turned out exactly as I was hoping, with a lot of variation in color and fun use of color. And if you're wondering about that padauk board, I didn't give up on it. I took it over to my new table saw, which I'm pretty excited about. This was the very first time I got to use it. And I cut up each of the edges because once I had flattened this using the router, it actually looked like just the edge pieces had really failed with regards to the glue joints. So I was kind of happy about that. And I'm sure I'll get some flack about the fact that I'm doing a glue up on my brand new table saw. I did put a board between it to try and protect it. So I promise you I didn't get glue on my new saw stop. The next step is to put handles on the board. I use this round nose bit and a jig that I made. I'll secure it to the board on the end just using some clamps, and I'll line it up with the center of the board, and then I just drop the router in place. I could probably use a plunge base on this because I do have the plunge base for my router, but for some reason I never use it. I find lowering it into place, I can still be really accurate and the process goes well, but there is a factor of you don't want to go too fast and you don't want to go too slow. If you go too fast, you'll get tear out on the end of the board, and if you go too slow, you'll end up burning it, especially on the maple. So luckily, I've kind of gotten to the point where I do this enough that I don't end up with burns, but when I first started out, I definitely got a lot of burns on maple, so I worked really hard on not having to do that anymore. So I added the handles to both ends of the walnut board, the maple board, and here's that padauk board. She's looking good. She caught up with the rest of her team, and I got her back on track. Then I added that 1/8 inch round over to the walnut board. I did the corners and then I went around each of the edges. I find that if I do the corners first, I have a lot less tear out, and it looks really good to have that perfect corner, which I'll show you here. And then for the maple board, I tried using a larger bit. I wanted to see what it would look like if I did a 1/4 round over. And I liked the look of it, but I definitely got a lot more tear out. And I'm not sure if it's because it's a larger bit, or I bought these bits from Ryobi and I'm not sure if maybe they just aren't very sharp. So I tried that again with the padauk and it actually went a little bit better. So it could be species of wood, maybe getting more tear out, or it could be maybe the bit isn't quite sharp enough. So I think I'm going to get a better quality bit and see how that goes. Then I will hand sand all of those edges using the 80 grit, 120, 180, 220, and 320, just so that they're perfect, because that seems to be where people grab the most. And I'm going to do the handles. So this is a pretty meticulous process, sanding all of these edges and sanding the handles, and I touch them over and over again just to make sure that they are perfect. And then my favorite part, I'm going to dip each of the boards in food grade mineral oil. I leave the boards in the oil for 5 minutes just to let them saturate well, and then I let them dry. Usually it's overnight. Now the padauk board ended up being too large for my dipping, so you guys get to see me just pour mineral oil over it instead. But I saturated the entire board and then let them sit overnight. And then it's the final step. I added wood wax to each of these boards. I like this walrus oil wood wax. It lasts a long time. I use a cutting board that I made and I cook, I would say, every single night of the week. And I usually only have to re-wax them about every 6 months. So it does really hold up well if you're ever like, how long does this last? That's kind of my general outcome with these boards. Thank you so much for joining me for this project. I had a fantastic time creating these boards and experimenting with some color. And like I said, I had my first shop accident and it went pretty well, I think, in the end, and nobody really got hurt except for maybe I was sad for a day. If you liked these boards and you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Leave me a comment. I love getting tips and tricks that people have tried in their own shop. And if you have time, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. These boards turned out beautiful, and I'm so glad you joined me for this project. I'll see you next time in the shop.